Trump's latest move was meant to project strength. It was supposed to signal resolve, dominance, a return to hard-nosed deal-making that would bend allies and rivals alike to Washington's will. Instead, what has unfolded over the past few weeks looks increasingly like the opposite, a sequence of decisions that are not just failing to deliver results, but actively pushing long-standing allies further away. And that raises a far more uncomfortable question than most headlines are willing to confront. Is this simply another tactical misstep, or are we watching a deeper collapse in America's ability to lead its own alliance system? Because when you look closely at the reactions coming not from adversaries, but from partners, a pattern begins to emerge. And by the end of this analysis, it becomes very difficult to escape the conclusion that this isn't just a blunder. It's a turning point. Now, on the surface, the administration's approach appears straightforward enough. Apply pressure, demand concessions, force negotiations onto favorable terms. It's a strategy rooted in the belief that the United States still holds overwhelming leverage economically, militarily, diplomatically, and for decades that assumption held true. But the critical error here lies in failing to recognize how much that landscape has changed, because the factual foundation tells a rather different story. Over the past several years, key allies from Europe to Asia have been steadily diversifying their economic relationships. Trade dependencies have shifted, supply chains have been reconfigured, and perhaps most importantly, political trust in Washington has eroded. Not vanished entirely, but weakened enough that compliance is no longer automatic. Take recent negotiations with European partners. The administration's demands were framed as non-negotiable. Tariff threats were issued, deadlines imposed. And yet, instead of immediate alignment, what followed was hesitation, delay, and in some cases, outright resistance. European officials, speaking both publicly and privately, signaled a growing unwillingness to accept terms dictated under pressure. Now, that alone might not seem unprecedented. After all, allies occasionally push back. But here's where it becomes significant. This resistance isn't isolated. It's consistent and it's spreading. In Japan, similar dynamics are unfolding. Long considered one of America's most reliable partners, Tokyo has begun quietly recalibrating its approach. Negotiations that would once have been concluded swiftly are now drawn out, scrutinized, and increasingly framed in terms of mutual benefit rather than unilateral concession. And as one senior policy analyst noted in a recent briefing, Japan is no longer negotiating from a position of dependency, but from a position of choice. That distinction matters enormously, because it signals a shift in leverage, not absolute, but perceptible. And once that shift begins, it rarely reverses easily. But perhaps the most telling reactions are coming from smaller allies, countries that historically had the least room to maneuver. Canada, for instance, has responded to recent policy moves with an unusual degree of firmness. Public messaging has grown sharper, diplomatic language less accommodating, and behind the scenes there is increasing discussion about reducing exposure to American policy volatility. Now, one might ask, why now? Why are these reactions intensifying at this particular moment? And this is where the expert analysis becomes particularly revealing. Several foreign policy specialists have pointed to a common thread: unpredictability. Not strategic unpredictability, which can sometimes be useful, but erratic, inconsistent signaling that makes long-term planning nearly impossible. Because allies don't simply respond to individual decisions. They respond to patterns, and when those patterns suggest instability, the rational response is not confrontation, but distancing. In other words, what looks like resistance is in many cases risk management. And here's where the situation becomes even more problematic. Because the administration appears to be interpreting this distancing not as a warning signal, but as defiance requiring escalation. More pressure, more threats, more demands. It's a feedback loop, and not a particularly healthy one. If that sounds familiar, it should, because we've seen similar dynamics play out before. In the later stages of other declining hegemonic systems, there is often a period where leadership attempts to reassert control through increasingly forceful measures, only to find that those measures accelerate the very decline they are meant to prevent. The British Empire in its later years faced comparable challenges. Efforts to maintain influence through economic pressure and political coercion often produced short-term compliance, but long-term resentment and eventual disengagement. The lesson wasn't that power disappeared overnight, it was that its effectiveness diminished gradually, then suddenly, and this is precisely the pattern that seems to be emerging now. But it gets worse, because the consequences of alienating allies extend far beyond diplomatic friction. They begin to reshape the entire strategic landscape. Consider defense cooperation. For decades, joint initiatives have relied on shared trust and aligned objectives. If that trust weakens, coordination becomes more difficult. Intelligence sharing becomes more cautious. Strategic alignment becomes conditional. And in economic terms, the implications are even more immediate. Trade agreements stall, investment flows shift, alternative partnerships become more attractive. We are already seeing early signs of this. European leaders exploring deeper ties within their own bloc. Asian economies strengthening regional frameworks. Even traditionally pro-American governments hedging their positions by engaging more actively with alternative powers. Now, none of this happens overnight, and it's important not to exaggerate. The United States remains a dominant force. Its alliances are not collapsing tomorrow. But, and this is the critical point, they are evolving, and not necessarily in ways that favor Washington. So what does all this mean in practical terms? Well, let's break it down. If allies become less willing to align automatically, then every negotiation becomes more complex, more time-consuming, more uncertain. That in turn reduces the administration's ability to deliver quick wins, the very outcomes it relies on to demonstrate strength. And if those wins become harder to achieve, the temptation is to escalate further, to double down, to apply even more pressure. But, as we've already seen, that approach risks producing the opposite effect. It's a classic misreading of leverage, the assumption that because power exists, it can be applied without consequence, when in reality, power is relational. It depends not just on capability, but on perception, trust, and willingness of others to engage. And when those elements begin to erode, the application of pressure becomes less effective, sometimes even counterproductive. Now, at this point, one might reasonably ask, is there still time to reverse this trajectory? The answer, technically, is yes. Diplomatic relationships are resilient. Trust can be rebuilt. Policies can be adjusted. But, and this is where the situation becomes particularly delicate, reversal requires recognition of the problem. And so far there is little indication that such recognition is occurring. Instead, the narrative being presented suggests success, strength, dominance, even when the underlying outcomes tell a different story. And that disconnect is perhaps the most concerning element of all. Because when leadership begins to believe its own messaging rather than the evidence in front of it, the capacity for course correction diminishes significantly. Now, let's step back for a moment, because there's a broader implication here that extends beyond any single policy or negotiation. What we may be witnessing is not just a series of tactical errors, but a structural shift in how American power operates on the global stage. For decades, that power rested not only on economic and military strength, but on a network of relationships built on mutual interest and, crucially, mutual trust. Allies aligned not just because they had to, but because they believed in the stability and predictability of the system. If that belief weakens, the system itself begins to fragment. And fragmentation doesn't necessarily mean collapse. It means complexity, multipolarity, a world where alignment is fluid rather than fixed. In such a world, influence must be earned continuously, not assumed. And that brings us back to the central issue. The current approach appears to be operating on assumptions that no longer fully apply. That leverage is absolute. That alliances are fixed. That pressure produces compliance, but the evidence suggests otherwise. And if that evidence continues to accumulate, if allies continue to resist, to hedge, to distance, then the consequences will become increasingly difficult to ignore. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. Trade negotiations that take longer, defense initiatives that face delays, diplomatic efforts that yield less predictable outcomes. Individually, these may seem manageable. Collectively, they represent a significant shift. So, where does this leave us? Bringing all of this together, the pattern is remarkably clear. An approach designed to project strength is producing hesitation. A strategy intended to secure alignment is generating distance. And a belief in overwhelming leverage is colliding with a reality of evolving power dynamics. Trump's latest blunder isn't just that he pushed too hard. It's that he pushed in a way that revealed the limits of that pressure. And once those limits are visible, they cannot be unseen. Looking ahead, the implications are substantial. If current trends continue, the United States will find itself negotiating in a more constrained environment. Not weaker in absolute terms, but less dominant in relative ones. Allies will continue to cooperate, but more selectively, more cautiously, more conditionally. And over time, that subtle shift may prove far more consequential than any single policy failure. Because influence, once diluted, is exceedingly difficult to restore. The broader context, then, is not just about one administration or one set of decisions. It's about a transition, a movement away from a system defined by clear hierarchy toward one characterized by negotiation, balance, and at times friction. And in that system, missteps carry greater weight. So perhaps the most uncomfortable conclusion is also the simplest. This isn't just a blunder that went wrong, it's a signal that the rules of the game are changing, and that those who fail to recognize that change risk finding themselves playing by outdated assumptions. And when that realization finally arrives, it rarely feels like a sudden shock. It feels like something that was obvious all along, just ignored until the consequences became impossible to avoid.